When I was a kid, I thought that real reorchestration, not, cheap MIDI Uncanny Valley of Sound, which I promise does exist and we will talk about it.
It's happened to us all. You see an animated face in a game, a TV show, a movie that stirs this deep, almost primal impulse at the core of your being. Something is simply wrong. It's clearly supposed to be a human. It's not a bad render of a human, but something about it is just fundamentally off. Enter the Uncanny Valley, as folks dabbling in AI, psychology, and the weird side of the internet already have before you. The gist is, there's a positive correlation between the increasing level of realism with which we depict the human form and our brain recognizing the depiction as a lifelike human. But there's a point at which, when a human facsimile approaches the most lifelike realism, there's a disconnect. We register that this mostly human image isn't actually human. The replication is nearing perfection, but just enough of its features are distorted or absent or incorrect somehow that there's this feeling of discomfort far greater than we'd get looking at a less realistic, more stylized render. They call it a valley because when you plot this relationship on a spectrum from stylized to realistic against a spectrum of recognition/comfort, there's a very sudden dip. And there you have the visual uncanny valley. But what about our other senses? What about the other primary way we perceive and recognize the wider world? What about sound?
So in honor of the new place, the new setup, the new subscribers, and the 10th episode of the show, I can't believe it myself, I'm making a video tonight on a topic that I've been trying to explain in words in vain for a long time now. And whoever would have thought that it'd be video games that'd give me the basis I'd need to prove this point, that there does in fact exist an uncanny valley of sound, and I can both quantitatively and qualitatively prove that it exists. Keep in mind, the uncanny valley phenomenon is completely subjective, and the reason that I bring this up is because many people don't even notice what I'm about to talk about, and a lot of people who do notice don't even care. And that's fine, but at the time I started looking into this, I had encountered enough people that did care to make it worth my while to try and find an answer. And to do that, we're going to do a few things. Now, as y'all know by now, I like to view things within their full context, and tantamount to this discussion is an explanation of just how game sound has evolved over the years. So we're going to break that down, and then afterwards, we'll talk about how and why game synthesizers at a very specific point in the timeline tried and failed to more realistically emulate real-life instruments. Let's do it.
Everybody's gone to bed and sleep and we're up all night. Games and movies are our sweet reveries. We present creative soliloquies. Everybody's gone to bed and sleep and we're up all night. Games and movies are our sweet reveries. We present creative soliloquies.
So you might be asking, why video games to make this point? Well, aside from the intersection of gaming and music being one of the big things I started this channel to explore, Art, Music, Dialectical 3-part series, episode 7 through 9, go check it out now. Let's consider the unique things about game music, primarily how the timeline of game music mirrors the timeline of animated human forms. We started off simple and stylized and progressed to ultra-realism. The unique thing that unites modern game music as a genre is the fact that it was written for games and is therefore sometimes modular. But that's it. Technology has advanced to the point where you can have your game exist in whatever sound world you want. But it wasn't always like that. Back in the day, game sound was limited by the hardware, and so each game had to make use of the same palette of sounds.
This is actually another thing that makes game sound unique. Its origins in a completely electronic space gradually worked its way towards acoustic sound, slowly coming into realism much like cartoon figures, animated characters from movies and stuff. So, on the one end of the spectrum, you've got our 8-bit sounds, the most stylized, cartoony, the furthest thing possible from being a real instrument. While on the other end, you've got full-fledged symphonies like you typically hear in AAA games today. You've maybe heard the word chiptune floating around before, and this is what it refers to: 8-bit, 16-bit synthesizers. The name comes from the fact that early video game consoles had a chip built into them specifically for the generation of sounds. More on that later.
To acknowledge chiptunes as their own entity on the spectrum means we first need to clarify exactly how we can consider game synthesizers specifically to be their own family of instruments. It's all about context. Yes, synths had been in use all through the 20th century in various genres, some of which we talked about last video, but the specific context of games gives synths used in consoles like the NES or Genesis a special identity, even if the sounds are similar to what you might hear in Fusion, for example. Even though chiptunes are no longer functionally necessary in the role they were created for, i.e. game tunes, they served a role in a significant moment in history that compels us to remember them fondly, and that memory makes them their own thing. Everyone's seen a movie or a TV show where they make references to gaming, and the sounds, if not the visuals, are often made to resemble games of the late 80s and early 90s. And that's because that aesthetic is associated specifically with video games. So unless you're a nerd and you're working on the amazing world of Gumball and you're referencing all kinds of games, you're probably going to opt for late 80s vibes as a calling card for game in your show, because that's the thing that's most easily identifiable as game. Unlike most game music now, which is aesthetically similar to what you'd hear either on an album or in a performance hall or even in a movie, it's unique to itself. And that's an important part of what we're talking about today: uniqueness, specifically with older sounds further removed from live instruments. Much like the expressly cartoony energy of classic rubber hose style cartoons, game music of that era wasn't trying to one-to-one emulate the sound of something else. And accordingly, chiptunes are still an extremely popular sound in everything from alternative hybrid albums to retro-styled indie games. I ended the last video by talking about how we see the preservation of older styles from specific periods in lots of mediums, from jazz to rock to gaming, and game music is exactly the same.
You seeing the connections? You liking them? If you don't see them, go watch the Dialectical miniseries. Right now. I'm serious. Click off the video right now. Go watch episodes 7 through 9 and thank me later. Anyhow, people are nostalgic for these sounds, not just because they represent video games of the 80s, but because they represent video games themselves. These sounds are super iconic. Here, I'll prove it. Okay, so check this out. This synthesizer is built from an actual NES RP2A03 Recode chip. So if you plug this end into a MIDI keyboard, you plug this end into your audio, and you can actually cycle through 90-something preset sounds on here that actually come from the real NES chip. Here, I'll show you. Now, check this out. Now, let's stop and think for a second about the fact that somebody went out of their way to build this thing, and that I then went out of my way to spend 150 something bucks on some weird website for it. That's the power that these sounds have. Now, for a little history lesson. I've talked briefly about it in the Shovel Knight video, but to get a little deeper, the relationship of game music and games themselves can broadly be described as a fashion versus function thing. The older games employed it in a more functional way to convey the atmosphere in an era when game graphics were insufficient to do that, whereas newer games use it more for artistic expression and diegetic immersion. So now, we're going to take a brief jaunt through game history and set up the spectrum a little more fully.
To begin with, the first, second, and third generations of gaming were entirely electronic. Consider the transition from Tennis for Two, widely regarded as the first video game, which was completely soundless, to Pong, which, even with its simple beeps and blips, still employed sound in a crucial manner to help the gamer identify more immediately with perceiving events on screen as reflective of their own actions through an avatar. And from there, like it always does in new mediums, as we've talked about, it blossomed with stuff like Pac-Man and Space Invaders. In a genre that was in its infancy, they established an important precedent for modular scoring and sound design that enhanced the experience of a visual medium that actively responded to its participants' input. Because with anything involving an avatar, the key is immersion, or at the very least, connection. And that wasn't such an easy thing back in the day. With today's VR and hyper-realistic graphics, it's insane to think about, but older games had to rely heavily on music to convey their moods and atmospheres. The gratification of collecting a power-up or repelling a Blinky, the panic of the invaders descending gradually faster. The sounds and music employed in these games were very simple, but they served an unbelievably important purpose. A purpose that carried into the NES era with more interesting and involved soundtracks on chips built specifically for them, like the Rico, for example. Scoring was, in a weird way, more important back then than it is now. And as if all that pressure on creating a good soundtrack wasn't enough, composers had the additional challenge of doing so with a limited sound palette completely dependent on the hardware limitations of these chips. And it needed to be catchy enough for it to be looped over and over and over again without numbing the player's brain. Being that game music was electronic for the first 3 generations, we've been static on the spectrum from non-real to real so far. Moving into the 90s, we find a particularly important point in the timeline with the Super Nintendo and the Genesis. The Super Nintendo in particular had a sound chip that employed compressed acoustic instrument samples, which gave soundtracks produced with it a very lush feel. The guy who's perhaps best known for employing its full potential is Nobuo Uematsu, who has already gotten some shine on this channel and I'm sure every other game music related channel on the internet. Simply put, this is the guy who damn near single-handedly masterminded the transition from beeps and blips to video game symphonies. So, Super Nintendo is incredibly important on our spectrum, because it represents the first time in the history of home consoles when it was clear what sounds were supposed to represent what instruments. That was the benefit of using samples. They technically were those instruments. But compressed, simplified, modulated, and synthesized as they were, the character of the sounds was changed so completely that, much like chiptunes, SNES sounds hold a distinct oral place for many of us.
In some strange way, the 4th and 5th generations actually had the best of both worlds to me. This was the point at which synthesizers had advanced enough to match up with real instruments, but they still had their own identity. And so the sounds of the Super Nintendo, the Nintendo 64, the PlayStation, and even the Game Boy Advance are all immediately recognizable as their own things, even though you can clearly tell what instruments you're supposed to be hearing. So, on our spectrum, we're further along. We're at, I would say, hand-drawn human forms, like Silver Age Disney or even anime. Can you kinda see where we're going with this?
When the CD-ROM enjoyed widespread success with the PlayStation, and to a lesser degree its competitor, the Saturn, all bets were off. CD-ROM technology meant that no longer were systems limited by the strength of their sound chip, only by the ambition and recording capability of their developers. Even though the PlayStation did have a sound chip, many games opted not to use it, with some notable exceptions like Final Fantasy VII. But because writing parts, hiring musicians, recording orchestral music, and engineering it to sound good was far more trouble than just having a few people handle it on the cheap, synths continued to remain in vogue for the 5th and 6th generations. We got some significant orchestration in some titles of the 6th generation, like Shadow of the Colossus or, in a very different way, Crash to Insanity, but this was not the standard.
So after that quick crash course, we're finally moving into the territory of virtual studio technology, or VSTs. If you're in music, you've definitely used these before. They've been a driving force in music production for a couple of decades now, and they were, and still very frequently are, the go-to solution for quick game compositional needs. And so they became very popular in the 6th generation of gaming onwards. They are, consequently, also the place where we find the Uncanny Valley of Sound.
Now, before we go on, please understand, I'm not trying to fault the people who use these more modern synths. Far from it. I know as well as anyone that sometimes you aren't going to have access to that full orchestra or that killing horn section, but you still need some version of those sounds. Now, blaming the composers for this problem is like blaming a chef serving severely sickening surf and turf after securing sundries from a seaside shack selling spoiled shrimp. And that shack is the only place in town to go for ingredients. And on that note, it isn't really the fault of the people making the synths either. In theory, the line from full facsimile to complete replication should be straight, right? But the Uncanny Valley tells us that this theoretically straight line has a big old dip in it. You'd think the more human elements you put in, the more human it'll sound. But, as I'll demonstrate and explain here, trying to calculate a human element is inherently unhuman.
Okay, so here's the thing. Because we're at the point in game history where live instrumentation versus VST usage was at the discretion of individual developers, there isn't a specific game console, or even era that I can point to where the Uncanny Valley of Sound started to rear its ugly head. It just kind of happened. So, rather than going on some wild goose chase needlessly speculating on the history behind how it happened, we'll instead take a look at both the qualitative and quantitative evidence of the phenomenon itself.
First, let's look at some of the more specific sound differences between live instrumentation and VSTs. To do that, for the first time on the show, we're going to do some experimentation of our own here by effecting a real-time comparison. This is Sonatina Orchestra, a free VST plugin that I sometimes use for horns and string instruments. It's a great plugin for what it is. On the live instrument side, most of you know I play piano as my main instrument, but since I don't have a real acoustic piano, I'm going to be tapping two other instruments I'm familiar with, the clarinet and the trombone. So for this comparison, we're going to be checking out the waveforms of two notes sitting in a normal, comfortable range on both instruments, and comparing them to the waveform of the same note on the same instrument in the VST. Quick lesson for those who don't know.
Quick disclaimer, the phrase "for those who don't know" is not meant to be patronizing in any way, and literally just is meant to inform on things I bring up that aren't necessarily general knowledge. Anyhow,
all sound, audible or not, comes in the form of waves. The higher the frequency, the rate it vibrates, the higher the sound, and the lower the frequency, the lower the sound. A waveform is a visual representation of this that also shows us things like amplitude, or how loud the sound is, represented by the width of the waveform, and timbre, the specific quality or character of the sound. So here we go. Clarinet first. Then trombone. Now we'll drop these into our digital audio workstation, or DAW. We'll cue up our Sonatina Orchestra. We'll play the corresponding notes on the corresponding instruments. Now we'll get our waveforms. I recorded the live horns in mono, meaning one output instead of two, which is stereo. So we're going to make all the audio mono so as to get the cleanest comparison possible. And we're ready.
now, first of all, you can probably hear the qualitative differences between the two, but let's go through them and talk about some terminology.
Firstly, attack and release. In music, we talk about attack, meaning how you start the note, and release, meaning how you end it. This is universal across all styles and instruments. Some instruments, like horns or synthesizers, you've got lots of control over your attack, and others, like acoustic piano, not so much. Attack and release are elements musicians spend years gaining total control over because it's constantly in play. So naturally, you want a VST that accurately emulates these things, or at least lets you adjust them. Sonatina Orchestra does, and so I adjusted the attack and release to try and closely emulate the real thing, but as you can hear, you can only do so much. Next, reverb. This is a big one. Of all the errors I notice with bad VST usage, this is the most common by far. Reverb has to do with how sound travels around an enclosed space. It's that nice, subdued echo, almost like an afterglow that we hear on our favorite records or in concert halls. A sound being dry means that there isn't much reverb, while being wet means there's a lot. And always, almost every time, VSTs insist on drowning their instruments in a monsoon of reverb, as a way, I guess, of masking the artificial quality of the instrument. But the first time you notice they do this, it's a done deal. All that super wet reverb does is make you notice the fakeness even more. It boggles my mind that in 2023, this is still used in a misguided attempt to deceive the human ear. And our VST here, remember that it was in stereo by default. You know why that is? To emulate being in a room with, guess what? Super wet, excessive reverb. Finally, timbre. Debatably the most important thing, and yet the thing that VSTs do the worst. Timbre means the unique quality of a sound. It's the reason you can hear the differences between clarinet, oboe, and saxophone. It's the reason we use lots of different instruments when we write big works. It's legitimately the equivalent of color when it comes to sound. It's the thing that makes most music interesting to listen to. The biggest issue with timbre and VSTs is that it's something that's just a little different for every player. For example, qualitatively, we can hear that the timbre of the notes I played in a live setting is closely replicated in the VST. But if we zoom way in on our waveforms here, you can see how much cleaner and more consistent the live timbre was. It's almost like the machine is overcompensating for the human element. VSTs very literally try way too hard to get an accurate instrument sound.
This is the thing that VSTs struggle with the hardest. Most modern VSTs use a set of pre-recorded live sounds as a basis for further modulation and manipulation by the human hand. Unfortunately, your modulation options are still governed by a set of calculations, and it's a practical impossibility that any machine could ever accurately capture this human element. The reason? Chaos.
The concept of chaos tells us that even when something can theoretically be predicted, you probably won't be able to because, to put it frankly, shit happens. Everybody is different. Every day is different. Every room, every climate, instrument, mood, the construction outside, how many times you tune, whether you ate breakfast the week before, how many pets you had growing up. Any little thing can and will affect every note anyone could ever play. And writing an algorithm that could capture the infinite complexity of our universe is impossible. Chaos is secretly at the core of both creativity and art itself. It's the reason that we're all individuals capable of expressing ourselves differently. Chaos is so important to art and creativity that producers and engineers will actually purposely leave recording flaws, like missed or flubbed notes or small differences in tone, in the music to make it authentic. It's a crazy thought, but without chaos, we fundamentally don't have real art. A machine cannot compute chaos, and the appropriateness of talking about this while AI art is such a contentious topic is not lost on me.
If these elements sound like small potatoes to you, it's kind of the point. The Uncanny Valley isn't about big macro differences, it's about little things that end up being crucial. Even though VST instruments are technically closer to real instruments than their 8 and 16-bit counterparts, that closeness absolutely works to their disadvantage. The computed elements in a synthesized instrument are even more obvious when that instrument is expressly trying not to sound synthesized. Like I said earlier, VSTs try way too hard to sound real, simultaneously falling short in that and straying too far from the uniqueness of synthesizers, losing out on that appeal. And therein lies the Uncanny Valley of Sound. If I've made a believer out of you, let's take a quick look at some examples.
Let's do Ratchet & Clank first. Check out the soundtrack of the original games. Techno, pulsing, synthesized, and unashamed of it. Good stuff. Now, let's listen to something from one of the newer Ratchet & Clank games. And you might say, well, that doesn't sound too bad. And that's your right to think. It doesn't sound flat out horrible. But put it next to something done with a full orchestra and choir, like, say, God of War Ragnarok. And the disparity becomes a little more obvious. Another fabulous example, Kingdom Hearts 3. You don't even have to compare it to the other games, just compare it to itself. Listen to any of the orchestrated music in this game. That sounds phenomenal. Now, let's be mature about this and listen to the music in the Pirate's World. Or the Gummy Ship music. Why? Why would they do that? Using these more advanced VSTs actually sounds worse than the compressed sounds and synthesizers of the 16-bit era. I would genuinely rather just hear those. And it's not just me.
Now, after hearing all this, you might say to yourself, oh, well, what do you propose to do about it? It's not as though you could do any better. You've spent all this time complaining. What are the solutions? And, you know, even though I did the goofy voice, that's actually a fair ask. It is. I don't know everything. I really don't. But seeing as how I hope to write video game music myself one day, I actually was mulling over a couple of solutions to this issue, and I think I came up with a pretty interesting one.
For starters, the sounds themselves aren't the primary issue, it's the things we put in them to try and make them sound more human. For the purposes of our experiment, it's actually good that I didn't use a piano, because pianos can actually be emulated pretty effectively by VSTs. The reason for this is that because of the way the instrument works, really the only thing you've got direct control over on the piano is the attack, and everything else about it can be accurately calculated by the machine. So, for things like horns, where that's not the case, I think we would be better served by focusing on just getting a pure, clean attack, like I did in the demonstration, and a consistent tone that matches the average tone of the horn. Ideally, composers and producers would then be able to modulate that tone to human specs, but as we discussed, that's a tough thing to do when your modulation options are also governed by calculations. You know what might provide a solution? The EWI. EWI stands for Electronic Wind Instrument. It's a fairly new thing. They can be programmed to play a variety of sounds via controls, much like a keyboard, but the difference is that it can be more directly modulated with the human breath and expressive things that wind players like to do, which would theoretically put you more directly in control of things like attack and release, for example. EWIs are amazing instruments with limitless potential, but they're more specialized than keyboards. And that's fine, but imagine if EWIs became standard tools for electronic large ensemble arranging. Imagine composers in control of their wind instruments the way they're in control of their keyboards or percussion with controllers and drum pads. Imagine pure horn synths modulated not by the computer presets, but by a real human touch and breath. I think that incorporating the EWI into standard electronic composing education might solve more things than we think.
So I don't usually ask this, but maybe I should start. What do you, the viewer, think? Does the Uncanny Valley exist for you? The Uncanny Valley of Sound? Do you notice the difference now that we've talked about it? If you do notice it, do you even care? You know, regardless, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it interesting. This is a topic I've been talking about, like I said, for years, and it's nice to finally make a video and hopefully shed some awareness on something that I think is actually pretty fascinating. If you liked it, consider subscribing, consider getting more eyes on the video, consider checking out the other stuff that I work on my website and such, as I continue my never-ending battle for channel and career viability. Peace.